Most people spend weeks trying to figure out what they did wrong. The connection was real, the warmth was mutual, and then something shifted, and suddenly the person who was showing up fully is showing up less. Calls get shorter, responses get slower. The intimacy that was building gets quietly, inexplicably dismantled. And the natural conclusion, the one that almost everyone reaches, is that the pulling back means the feeling is gone, that the distance is evidence of diminishing interest, that if someone truly wanted to be close, they would stay close. That conclusion is wrong, and the degree to which it is wrong is the degree to which loving an avoidant becomes unnecessarily painful. Because the pulling back, when it comes from an avoidant who genuinely loves you, is not the absence of feeling. It is the presence of too much feeling, meeting a nervous system that was never taught how to hold it. The retreat is not indifference wearing the clothes of distance. It is fear wearing the clothes of indifference. And the difference between those two things changes everything. Not just how the situation is interpreted, but how it is navigated, what it means about the relationship, and why, in the specific context of avoidant attachment, the pullback is often the most honest signal the person is capable of sending. To understand why the pulling back happens specifically when the love is real, the architecture of avoidant attachment has to be understood at the level of its origin rather than just its behavior. Because the behavior, the distance, the cooling, the retreat from closeness at the exact moment closeness was becoming something genuine, looks, on the surface, like a choice, like a decision made by someone who evaluated the connection and found it wanting, like the rational response of a person who simply isn't as invested as you are. It isn't a choice, not in the conscious deliberate sense that the word choice implies. It is a conditioned response that runs below the level of deliberate decision, generated by a nervous system that learned in its earliest and most formative experiences that closeness was not safe, not unsafe in the theoretical sense, unsafe in the lived, repeated, neurologically encoded sense of an environment in which emotional expression was consistently met with something other than the attunement and comfort that children require in order to develop a secure relationship with their own need for connection. The avoidant child, who became the avoidant adult, sitting across from you, pulling back at precisely the moment the warmth between you became real enough to matter, learned something fundamental in those early years. They learned that needing people produces pain, that expressing emotional need results in dismissal or criticism, or the particular kind of emotional unavailability in a caregiver that leaves a child more dysregulated after reaching for comfort than before. And the nervous system, which is extraordinarily good at learning from repeated experience, drew the logical conclusion from the evidence it was given. Closeness equals vulnerability. Vulnerability equals exposure. Exposure equals pain. Therefore, closeness, however desired, must be managed, must be kept at a distance where it cannot reach the depth at which it becomes genuinely threatening. This conclusion was not wrong, given the evidence it was drawn from. In the original environment, it was accurate. The problem is that the nervous system doesn't automatically update when the environment changes. The conclusion that was adaptive in childhood, keep the closeness manageable, keep the need suppressed, keep the distance maintained, continues to operate in adult relationships with the same authority it had when it was formed, regardless of whether the current person in front of the avoidant is anything like the caregivers who made the conclusion necessary in the first place. So when the avoidant pulls back from you specifically, from a connection that has been building towards something genuinely real, they are not responding to who you are or what you have done. They are responding to what the level of closeness you have reached together has activated in their nervous system. They are responding to the feeling of genuine attachment becoming undeniable, of your significance in their life, crossing the threshold from manageable to threatening, of the connection reaching a depth at which losing it would actually hurt in a way that the carefully maintained distance was designed to prevent ever happening. The pullback is, in this precise sense, proof of the feeling rather than evidence of its absence. The nervous system only deploys the retreat when there is something real enough to retreat from. Shallow connections don't trigger the deactivation machinery. Connections that stay at the surface, pleasant, enjoyable, but never reaching the depth at which genuine need and genuine vulnerability are activated, don't produce the pullback because they never reach the threshold that makes the pullback necessary. It is specifically the connections that go deep enough to matter, the people who get close enough to become genuinely significant, that activate the avoidance withdrawal response. You triggered the withdrawal because you got through. Not all the way. The architecture prevented full arrival, but far enough that the nervous system registered you as someone whose loss would be felt, someone whose presence had become woven into the avoidance experience of their own life, in a way that created real vulnerability. And real vulnerability to a nervous system trained to treat it as threat requires a response. The response is retreat, and the retreat is, underneath everything, a testament to how much you matter. This reframe is not offered as comfort designed to make the pain of the pullback more bearable. It is offered as accuracy, because the accurate interpretation of what is happening changes how you respond to it, and how you respond to it has significant consequences for what the relationship becomes or doesn't become. If the pullback is interpreted as diminishing interest, the natural response is pursuit, an increase in your own reaching, an attempt to close the distance by demonstrating more warmth, more availability, more visible investment in the connection, and pursuit, in the context of avoidant attachment, does the opposite of what it intends. It confirms the nervous system's assessment that the threat level is high. It increases the felt pressure of the attachment, which increases the activation of the deactivating strategies, which produces more distance rather than less. If the pullback is interpreted accurately, as the avoidance system responding to genuine feeling with the only regulatory strategy it currently knows, the response changes entirely. Not to indifference, not to performance of not caring, but to something more grounded and more genuinely useful, to the kind of steady, non-anxious presence that neither chases the distance nor collapses under it. That holds its own emotional ground, without requiring the avoidant to immediately return to the level of closeness that triggered the retreat, that communicates, through behavior rather than through words, that the connection is real and the person is not going anywhere, and the avoidance fear-driven retreat has not changed the fundamental quality of what is available between them. This response is genuinely difficult to sustain. It requires the person on the receiving end of the pullback to manage their own attachment anxiety in real time, without the reassurance that the avoidant is currently incapable of providing, while holding an accurate understanding of what the retreat actually means. It requires, in other words, a level of emotional regulation and psychological sophistication that is not easy to access in the middle of experiencing what feels like rejection. But it is the response that gives the relationship the best possible conditions for the avoidant to eventually find their way back, not because it is a strategy for producing a particular outcome, but because it is the authentic expression of a kind of security that the avoidance nervous system has never had the opportunity to learn from. Here is the part that almost nobody talks about when discussing avoidant pullback, and it is the part that most directly answers the question of why it is, in a specific and non-trivial sense, a good thing. The pullback creates conditions. It creates the specific conditions under which the avoidance nervous system can begin, tentatively and with many retreats, to update the conclusion it drew in childhood, the conclusion that closeness equals danger. Because the update, the neurological revision of a deeply encoded threat assessment, cannot happen through argument or through intention or through the avoidant deciding they want to be different. It can only happen through experience, specifically through the repeated experience of approaching closeness, retreating, and discovering that the world did not end, that the attachment was not destroyed, that the person they retreated from is still there, still genuinely available, still holding the connection with the same quality of care it had before the retreat. Each time this cycle completes, approach, retreat, return, and finding the connection intact, the nervous system receives a small piece of evidence that contradicts its original conclusion, not enough to overturn it immediately, but enough to begin the slow, cumulative process of building an alternative data set, of teaching the nervous system through repeated lived experience that this specific person in this specific relationship is not the environment that made the original conclusion necessary. That closeness here does not produce the pain that closeness produced in the original environment. That the vulnerability of genuine attachment, however threatening it feels, does not reliably lead to the dismissal or the overwhelm or the withdrawal of care that the nervous system learned to expect. This is what neurological reconditioning actually looks like in practice. Not a dramatic transformation, not a moment of insight that rewires the system overnight, but the patient, incremental accumulation of experiences that don't fit the old pattern, gradually building toward a nervous system that responds to genuine closeness with something other than automatic threat activation. The pullback is part of this process, not an interruption of it. The retreat and the return, the full cycle, is the unit of healing, not the approach alone. The approach and the retreat and the discovery that the connection survived the retreat. This is why attempting to prevent the pullback, to manage the avoidance comfort level so carefully that the deactivating strategies are never triggered, is ultimately counterproductive. It feels like the loving thing to do. If the closeness activates the retreat, then keeping the closeness at a level that doesn't activate the retreat seems like it would keep things more stable, more comfortable, more sustainable. And in the very short term, it does produce that effect. The avoidant remains regulated. The distance stays manageable. The relationship continues at the level of warmth that doesn't cross into the threatening territory. But nothing heals, because healing requires the threat response to be activated and then for the feared consequence not to materialize. A nervous system that is never exposed to the stimulus it fears never learns that the stimulus is survivable. The avoidant who is kept comfortable by a partner who manages the intimacy level carefully never has the opportunity to discover that genuine closeness does not produce annihilation. They are protected from the discomfort and simultaneously protected from the growth that the discomfort is the gateway to. The relationship that allows the pullback to happen, that holds steady through the retreat without collapsing or pursuing, that maintains the quality of the connection without requiring the avoidant to remain at a level of intimacy that their system cannot yet sustain. That relationship is doing something profound. It is providing, perhaps for the first time in the avoidant's life, the specific conditions that genuine healing requires. Not comfort, not the absence of the fear response, but the experience of the fear response activating and the feared outcome not arriving. The experience of retreating and finding, upon return, that the thing they retreated from is still there, unchanged, undiminished, unhurt by the retreat in a way that made the retreat feel necessary. There is something that needs to be said here about the person on the other side of the pullback, because the framing of the pullback as a good thing, as evidence of feeling, as part of a healing cycle, as the nervous system doing what it was conditioned to do, rather than the person making a choice to withdraw, can, if held carelessly, become a framework that asks too much of the person receiving the withdrawal, can become a reason to endure behavior that is genuinely costly, to absorb repeated retreats without limit, to prioritize the avoidance healing process over one's own need for consistent reciprocal connection. That is not what is being argued here. The pullback being understandable does not make it cost-free for the person experiencing it. The fear being the source of the retreat does not mean the retreat is painless to receive. And the potential for healing that the cycle represents does not obligate anyone to remain in a dynamic that is taking more than it is giving, that is producing more anxiety than it is producing genuine connection. That is asking the person on the receiving end to do an amount of emotional work that is not sustainable or fair. What matters is the distinction between the pullback that is part of a genuine movement toward closeness, the retreat that is followed by return. That exists within a broader trajectory of increasing trust and increasing willingness to stay, and the pullback that is simply the ongoing operation of an avoidant architecture that is not moving anywhere. The first is part of the process. The second is the process substituting for itself indefinitely, producing the appearance of a relationship without the reality of one ever fully forming. The difference is visible in the trajectory over time, not in any single retreat, which can look identical whether it is part of genuine growth or part of permanent pattern maintenance, but in the direction of travel across multiple cycles. Is the closeness, broadly, deepening? Are the retreats becoming slightly shorter, slightly less complete, followed by returns that go slightly further than the last? Is there, beneath the surface inconsistency of the approach and retreat cycle, a general movement toward more genuine presence rather than a stable orbit around the same level of managed distance? If there is genuine movement, the pullback is what it is being described as, the difficult but real expression of a nervous system learning, slowly and non-linearly, that closeness is survivable. If there is no movement, if the cycle repeats without direction, if the retreats are as deep and as long after a year as they were in the beginning, that is different information. Not information about the avoidance feeling, which may remain genuine throughout, but information about their current capacity, about whether the relationship, as it currently exists, has the conditions for the healing cycle to actually produce healing rather than simply perpetuate itself. The good thing about the pullback, and this is the dimension of it that tends to be most surprising and most genuinely useful once it is understood, is what it reveals about the relationship's potential. Because the avoidant doesn't pull back from connections that don't matter. The deactivating machinery is not activated by superficial warmth or by connections that stay safely at the surface. It is activated by depth, by genuine significance, by the specific quality of a connection that has reached the territory where real vulnerability lives. The pullback is, in this sense, a form of information about what the relationship is, not what it is performing as, not what it looks like from the outside, not what the avoidant says about it when the defenses are managing the conversation, but what it actually is at the level of the nervous system's honest assessment. The nervous system doesn't lie about significance. It responds to it. And the response, the retreat, the cooling, the managed distance, is the most honest thing the avoidant is capable of communicating about how much the connection matters. Understanding this changes the emotional experience of the pullback in a way that is not trivial. It doesn't eliminate the difficulty of it. Knowing that the retreat is fear-based rather than indifference-based doesn't make the absence of the warmth that was present before painless, but it relocates the experience. It moves it from the category of rejection, which activates the recipient's own attachment anxiety, their own self-doubt, their own fear of being inadequate or asking for too much, into the category of information. Information about the avoidant's internal state, about the depth of the connection, about what is being activated and what is being protected, and what, with the right conditions and the right time, might eventually be possible. That relocation is significant because rejection and information require completely different responses. Rejection requires either pursuit or withdrawal. Information requires understanding and a calibrated response that neither collapses under the weight of the retreat nor abandons the connection as though the retreat were the final word. The final word, in avoidant attachment, is rarely the retreat itself. The retreat is a sentence in the middle of a much longer story, and what that story ultimately says depends on what comes after it, on whether the person on the receiving end holds steady enough for the return to be possible, on whether the avoidant, finding upon return that the connection survived their absence, begins to accumulate the evidence their nervous system needs to revise its oldest and most load-bearing conclusion, on whether the cycle, repeated enough times with enough consistency on both sides, gradually produces the thing it is always moving toward, a nervous system that has learned, through the only means available to it, that the person in front of it is not the environment that made closeness dangerous, that this, specifically, is safe, that staying, however terrifying it remains, is survivable in a way that the original wound said it never would be. That learning, the deep neurological experiential learning that the pullback and return cycle slowly produces, is the good thing, not the pullback itself, which is painful and disorienting and asks a great deal of the person receiving it. but what the full cycle, completed with consistency and genuine care on both sides, can build over time, which is the thing the avoidant has been engineering against their entire relational life, the thing their architecture was constructed to prevent, the thing that, in the right relationship with the right person, holding the right quality of steady, grounded, non-anxious presence, becomes slowly and imperfectly, and with many retreats along the way, possible after all. Genuine closeness, not managed, not rationed, not maintained at the careful distance where loss is impossible because depth was never allowed, but real, mutual, undefended closeness with another person who knows the defended places and loves what is underneath them. That is what the pullback, in its own painful and roundabout way, is always trying to reach, not the retreat, the return. And the return, when it finally arrives without the retreat immediately following it, when the avoidance stays through the fear past the threshold where the nervous system always said leave, is worth every difficult moment that the cycle required to produce it. Not because it was easy, not because it was fair, but because it is real, and real, earned through the specific difficulty of this particular journey, has a quality that nothing easier or more straightforward could have produced. It has the quality of something that was genuinely worked for by two people, each doing their own version of the hardest thing their particular psychology required. And that quality of two people choosing, repeatedly and imperfectly, to stay present through the specific difficulty of finding their way toward each other, is the foundation that only this kind of journey can build. Everything else rests on what came before it, and what came before it was the pullback and the holding steady through the pullback, and the return, and the finding upon the return that the connection was still there. That is the cycle, that is the journey, and the good thing, the genuinely, specifically, profoundly good thing, is that it is possible at all. And possible is not a small word in the context of avoidant attachment. It is, in fact, the most radical word available, because the dominant narrative around avoidant attachment, the one that circulates most widely and lands most heavily on the people who have loved someone with this style, is that it isn't possible, that avoidants don't change, that the architecture is permanent, that the pullback will always be followed by another pullback, and the warmth will always be followed by cooling. And the investment of loving someone who is simultaneously drawn toward and terrified of closeness will always, eventually, produce the same outcome: exhaustion, confusion, the quiet devastation of a connection that kept almost arriving and never quite did. That narrative is not entirely wrong. For avoidants who never develop self-awareness about the pattern, who never encounter the specific conditions that allow the healing cycle to actually produce healing, rather than simply repeat itself, who never do the interior work that the pattern requires. For those avoidants, the prognosis is limited. The pullback will keep coming. The returns will keep being followed by retreats. The relationship will occupy the holding pattern that avoidant architecture produces and will stay there, orbiting the same level of managed intimacy until the person on the receiving end runs out of the particular combination of patience and hope that keeping the orbit going requires. But the narrative is not universally true, and understanding where it breaks down, understanding the specific conditions under which the avoidance pattern is genuinely interruptible rather than simply repeatable, is where the most important and most underappreciated territory in this entire subject lives. The first condition that makes genuine change possible is self-awareness, not the intellectual self-awareness that allows the avoidant to describe their own pattern accurately in conversation. Many avoidants can do this without the description producing any meaningful change in behavior, but the felt self-awareness that connects the intellectual understanding to the actual experience of the pattern in real time. The avoidant who can notice, in the moment of retreat, that the retreat is happening, who can observe themselves going cool and recognize the cooling as the deactivating strategy rather than as an accurate assessment of the relationship, who can feel the pull toward distance and simultaneously know that the pull is fear rather than wisdom. This quality of real-time self-awareness is genuinely rare, and it is genuinely difficult to develop without support. It requires the ability to observe one's own nervous system responses with enough detachment to recognize them as responses rather than realities, to see the fear-generated fault finding as fault finding rather than as accurate perception, to catch the elevation of alternatives in the act of being generated rather than simply experiencing the generated result as a genuine desire for something other than what the relationship offers. Developing this quality typically requires a therapeutic relationship, though not exclusively. It can develop through sustained, honest self-reflection of the kind that journals, meditation practices, or particularly revealing friendships sometimes produce. But the therapeutic relationship has specific advantages. The consistent, safe, attuned presence of another person who reflects the avoidance patterns back to them without judgment creates, over time, exactly the kind of corrective experience that builds the capacity for self-observation. The therapist models the thing the avoidance nervous system never learned, that genuine presence with another person, including the vulnerable self-revelation of being seen accurately, does not produce the feared outcome. And that modeling, repeated across many sessions over time, begins to build the neural pathways that genuine self-awareness requires. The second condition is motivation, and motivation in the context of genuine psychological change is not the same as desire. Desire for change is available to most avoidants at some level. The awareness that the pattern is costing them something, the wish to be different, the genuine longing for the kind of closeness the pattern keeps preventing. But desire is not sufficient to override a nervous system that is running on deeply encoded threat responses. The desire wants to stay. The threat response retreats anyway, and the gap between wanting to be different and actually being different in the moment when the deactivating strategies are running can feel unbridgeable. What produces the motivation strong enough to actually bridge that gap is what was described earlier in this discussion, the specific, accumulated, experiential evidence that the pattern has costs that the avoidant can no longer rationalize away. The relationship that ended because the pullback went too far one too many times. The person whose significance the comparison keeps confirming. The grief that suppression can no longer fully contain. The self-confrontation that arrives in the quiet and will not be redirected. These are not abstract motivators. They are visceral ones. They carry the weight of lived consequence rather than theoretical risk. And lived consequence, for the avoidant who has been successfully avoiding the weight of the pattern's costs through the various mechanisms of suppression and rationalization and forward momentum, lived consequence is the most powerful motivator available. This is, in the fullest and most honest sense, why the pullback being painful for the person receiving it is not simply a cost with no corresponding value. The pain is real, and it is not minimized here. But in the complete picture, the avoidance experience of the consequences of the pullback, particularly the experience of losing someone significant through the accumulated weight of too many retreats, or of watching the comparison run without resolution across subsequent connections that keep failing to reach what was lost. That experience is often what generates the specific quality of motivation that genuine change requires, not the mild discomfort of recognizing a pattern, the acute, personal, impossible to rationalize away experience of what the pattern has actually cost. The third condition is perhaps the most practically important for the person who is currently in a relationship with an avoidant and trying to navigate the pullback in real time. It is the quality of the relational environment that the person on the receiving end creates, not through strategy, not through emotional management designed to produce a particular outcome in the avoidant, but through the genuine, grounded expression of their own secure functioning. Secure functioning, in this context, means something specific. It means being genuinely okay, not performatively okay, not strategically okay, but actually regulated and grounded in one's own sense of self and value. During the periods of the avoidance retreat, it means holding the connection warmly without holding it desperately. It means communicating availability without communicating need in a way that activates the avoidance threat response. It means being clear about one's own limits, about what is acceptable and what is not, about how long the pullback can last before it begins to cost more than the relationship is currently returning, without those limits being delivered as ultimatums that increase the felt pressure rather than clarifying the genuine conditions. This is extraordinarily difficult to do, genuinely rather than performatively, because genuinely secure functioning in the face of repeated withdrawal requires the person to actually be okay, to have enough internal resource, enough self-worth, enough life outside the relationship that the avoidance retreat does not constitute a crisis for them. And for many people who love avoidance, particularly those whose own attachment history has created a degree of anxiety around connection, this genuine okayness requires their own interior work running parallel to the avoidance, their own therapy, their own self-examination, their own gradual development of the internal stability that allows them to be a genuinely regulating presence rather than a person whose own anxiety in the face of the retreat inadvertently confirms the avoidance. Nervous system's assessment that the situation is threatening. When both people are doing their own work, when the avoidant is developing the self-awareness and motivation and internal capacity that genuine change requires, and the person who loves them is developing the genuine security and self-knowledge and regulated presence that the avoidance healing requires, something becomes possible that neither person can produce alone. A relationship that is genuinely healing for both of them. Not in the sense of one person healing the other, which is not how healing works and which places an unfair burden on whichever person is cast in the healer role, but in the sense of two people, each working on their own interior, creating together the specific relational conditions that each of them individually needs for their own growth. The avoidant needs the experience of closeness not leading to the pain the nervous system was trained to expect. They need repeated, patient, genuinely consistent evidence that genuine attachment is survivable, that the person they love will still be there after the retreat, that vulnerability does not produce dismissal or overwhelm or the withdrawal of care. These experiences can only be provided relationally. They require another person, present and consistent, to complete the circuit. The person who loves the avoidant often needs, in their own way, to develop a kind of love that doesn't depend on continuous reassurance, that can hold genuine care for another person without requiring that care to be constantly and explicitly returned in order to remain stable, that has enough internal foundation to sustain connection through periods of the other person's unavailability without either collapsing into anxiety or hardening into withdrawal. This too is a form of growth, a different form, requiring different work, but no less significant. The relationship that holds both of these growth processes simultaneously, imperfectly, non-linearly, with frequent periods where one or both people are operating below their best capacity, is doing something genuinely rare. It is being, for both people, the specific relational environment that their particular psychology most needs. And the pullback, in this context, is not an obstacle to that environment. It is one of its defining features. It is the specific challenge that requires both people to develop the capacities they are in the relationship to develop. This is the deepest sense in which the pullback is a good thing. Not good in the sense of comfortable or easy or without cost, but good in the sense of functionally necessary to the growth that the relationship is capable of producing. A relationship that never activated the avoidance threat response would never require the avoidant to learn to manage it differently. A relationship that never required the other person to sustain connection through the avoidance retreat would never require the other person to develop the genuine security that sustaining it builds. The difficulty is not incidental to the growth. The difficulty is the mechanism of it. There is a quality that develops in the person who navigates the pullback well, who holds steady through the retreat without pursuing, who maintains genuine connection without demanding continuous demonstration of it, who communicates their own limits clearly without weaponizing them. That is worth naming explicitly. It is a particular kind of relational confidence, not the confidence of someone who has never been challenged, never been uncertain, never had to sit with the discomfort of a connection whose return was not guaranteed. but the confidence of someone who has been through that specific difficulty repeatedly and has discovered each time that they are capable of it, that the retreat does not destroy them, that their own sense of worth and value does not depend on the avoidant's current level of engagement, that they can hold love for someone through the person's fear-driven absence and find, on the other side of the absence, that the love is intact and the self is intact and the connection, if the avoidant returns to it, is intact. That confidence is genuinely earned. It cannot be produced by easier relational experiences. It specifically requires the challenge of loving someone whose fear keeps testing the stability of the connection, because it is specifically that test that reveals and then builds the stability being tested. The person who emerges from navigating this pattern well, who has done it enough times to trust their own capacity to sustain it, carries a relational confidence that is qualitatively different from what they brought into the relationship, more grounded, more genuinely secure, more able to love without needing the love to be continuously and explicitly confirmed in order to remain real. The avoidant who has a partner with this quality of relational confidence is receiving something they have never had before, something their nervous system has been waiting for without knowing it was waiting for as long as the pattern has been running, which is the experience of another person being genuinely unfrightened by the retreat, not performing unfrightened, not managing their fear skillfully enough that the avoidant can't see it, actually, genuinely, grounded in themselves unfrightened, present before the retreat, present during it, present after it, not because they don't notice the retreat, not because it doesn't affect them, but because their own foundation is solid enough that the retreat doesn't destabilize it. That quality of presence, genuinely secure, genuinely steady, genuinely available, without being genuinely desperate, is the most powerful counter-conditioning stimulus that the avoidance nervous system can encounter, because it directly contradicts the original learning. The original learning said that closeness produces pain, that attachment makes the self vulnerable to hurt, that genuine connection always eventually produces the dismissal or overwhelm or withdrawal of care that made distance necessary in the first place. The genuinely secure partner says, through their behavior rather than their words, over and over, through the full cycle of approach and retreat and return, none of that is happening here. The closeness is not producing pain. The attachment is not producing dismissal. The genuine connection is surviving your fear of it. Each cycle that completes with this quality of consistency rewrites, incrementally, the avoidance nervous system's assessment of what closeness reliably produces. The rewriting is slow. It takes many cycles. It takes consistency over time rather than intensity in any single moment. And it requires the genuinely secure partner to maintain that quality of presence, not because they have no needs of their own. They do, and those needs matter and deserve to be met, but because their needs are being met sufficiently from their own internal resources and from the relationship's genuine warmth during its non-retreating phases to sustain the consistency the rewriting requires. When the rewriting accumulates sufficiently, when the avoidance nervous system has had enough repeated experience of genuine closeness, not producing the feared outcome to begin updating its threat assessment, something in the pullback changes. The retreats become shorter, not immediately, not dramatically, not in a way that announces itself as progress, but measurably across time. The distance of the retreat reduces, the return comes sooner, and crucially, the depth of closeness that the avoidant can sustain before the retreat triggers increases. The threshold moves. The territory of manageable intimacy expands, and the relationship, which was always capable of more than the avoidant's current window of tolerance permitted, begins to grow into that capacity. This is not a linear process. There will be retreats that seem to contradict the progress, moments where the closeness reaches a new depth, and the retreat that follows is more complete than anything that has happened in months, because new depth activates the threat response freshly, regardless of how much reconditioning has accumulated at the previous depth. Each new level of genuine intimacy is in a sense the first time, and the first time for the avoidance nervous system, always produces the retreat. But the retreat from new depth is not regression. It is the pattern operating at a new level, which means the pattern has already been overcome at every previous level. The avoidant who is retreating from a depth of genuine intimacy that would have been unimaginable to them at the beginning of this relationship is not failing. They are succeeding imperfectly and with the specific kind of 2 steps forward, 1 step back rhythm that neurological reconditioning actually moves in at the most difficult psychological project available to them. What the person who loves them needs to hold through all of this, through the non-linearity and the retreats at new depths and the moments that look like regression but are actually progress at a level that wasn't available before, is the long view, the trajectory rather than the current position, the direction of travel across the full arc of the relationship rather than the specific coordinates of any given moment within it. A long view is genuinely difficult to maintain in the middle of a retreat. When the warmth has cooled and the availability has reduced and the person who was present last week is less present this week, the long view requires holding against the immediate evidence of the retreat, the accumulated evidence of everything the relationship has been and where it has been going. It requires trusting the trajectory when the current moment is contradicting it. It requires the kind of faith that is not blind, not faith in a fantasy of who the avoidant might eventually become, but faith in the specific, evidence-based trajectory of who they have been becoming, imperfectly and non-linearly, across the full duration of what has been built together. That faith, when it is grounded in genuine evidence of genuine movement, is not naive. It is sophisticated. It is the faith of someone who understands the mechanism well enough to distinguish a retreat that is part of the process from a retreat that signals the process is stalled. Who can hold the long view because the long view is accurate, because the trajectory is genuinely there, because the direction of travel across the full arc is genuinely toward more closeness rather than an endless orbit of the same managed distance. And when the avoidant finally stays, when the retreat that would have followed the new depth doesn't come, or comes briefly and shallowly and is followed by a return that goes further than any previous return, what is present in that moment is something that neither person could have produced through any other path. A closeness that was earned through the specific difficulty of its own becoming, a genuine mutual presence that carries in its texture the history of everything it took to arrive at it. The avoidant who stays through their own fear, who feels the pull toward retreat and chooses, perhaps for the first time in their relational life, to remain instead, is not the person they were at the beginning. They are someone who has done the most difficult thing their specific psychology makes available, who has stayed in the room that their nervous system kept insisting was too dangerous to remain in, who has discovered, through the staying, that the room was never as dangerous as the fear said, that the closeness, entered fully and without the managing distance, produces not the annihilation the nervous system promised, but something entirely different, something that the avoidant, in all their years of careful engineering against this exact experience, had never fully allowed themselves to have, the experience of being genuinely, undefendedly close to another person and surviving it, more than surviving it, finding, in the staying, that the thing they were always protecting themselves from was never the threat, that the real cost was always the protection itself, and that what was available on the other side of it, what has always been available, waiting with complete patience for the fear to finally step aside, is exactly what they needed most. That is where the pullback was always going, through the retreat and the return and the cycle and the growth and the long, difficult, non-linear journey toward a nervous system that finally, tentatively, then more completely, learns that this is safe, that this person is safe, that staying is safe, and that the love, which was always real, which was present from the beginning beneath all the managing and the retreating and the fear, is finally safe to feel.